Frederick Hunt stood in the cramped laboratory at Harvard's Underwater Sound Research Facility in October 1944, staring at oscilloscope readings that made no sense. His team had dropped hydrophones to various depths in the Atlantic, testing sonar ranges for submarine detection. At 3,000 feet down, something impossible happened. A small explosive charge detonated off Bermuda registered clearly on receivers 900 miles away near Cape Cod. Hunt checked the calculations 3 times. Sound waves at that distance should have scattered and died in the ocean's turbulence within 100 miles, maybe 200 at most. The Navy had recruited Hunt from Harvard's physics department in 1941 specifically because he understood wave propagation better than anyone in America. Before the war, he'd spent years studying how sound behaved in different mediums: air, water, solid materials. His sonar systems helped Allied destroyers detect German U-boats lurking beneath convoy routes. But this new phenomenon defied everything acoustic physics predicted about underwater sound transmission. Hunt assembled his data sheets across the laboratory bench. Temperature readings showed the pattern. Ocean water grew colder as you descended from the sun-warmed surface, but only down to about 3,000 feet. Below that depth, a different dynamic took over. Pressure from the weight of water above began warming the depths again, creating a thermal sandwich. Cold layer trapped between warm surface and warm deep water. His hand sketched the temperature profile on graph paper. The coldest band sat right around 3,000 feet, varying slightly by latitude. Sound waves traveled slower in cold water than warm water. Basic physics. Which meant sound waves entering that cold channel from above or below would bend back toward the center, trapped by the temperature gradients like light in a fiber optic cable. The cold layer became a horizontal tunnel stretching across entire ocean basins. Hunt called it the deep sound channel, though other researchers would later name it the SOFAR channel. Sound fixing and ranging. He spent the next 6 months confirming the discovery with deliberate experiments. Charges detonated at exactly 3,000 feet, transmitted across ridiculous distances. Charges at 1,000 feet or 5,000 feet scattered and faded within normal ranges. The channel's sweet spot ran right through that coldest water layer where sound refused to escape upward or downward. The implications hit Hunt during a December meeting with Navy brass in Washington. If sound traveled thousands of miles through this channel, and if you positioned sensitive enough hydrophones at the right depth, you could theoretically hear submarines from enormous distances. Not the active sonar pings his team had developed. Those announced your presence to every enemy vessel within range. This would be passive listening, silent and undetectable. Admiral Harold Bowen, chief of the Office of Naval Research, asked the obvious question: how far could this really work? Hunt pulled out his Atlantic charts. Based on temperature profiles and ocean bottom topology, he estimated the channel extended continuously from Greenland to South America, from Europe to the Caribbean. A whisper entered at one end, could emerge at the other, degraded but recognizable. Bowen wanted proof before committing resources. Hunt promised definitive tests by spring. The war ended before Hunt could build his ocean-spanning listening system, but the discovery wouldn't leave him alone. While colleagues returned to pure academic research, Hunt kept refining the concept through 1946 and 1947, calculating optimal hydrophone depths, mapping where the sound channel sat deepest and most stable. He understood what most Navy officers couldn't yet grasp. The next war wouldn't be fought with surface fleets. It would be fought by submarines, and whoever heard those submarines first would control the oceans. Hunt's wartime sonar work had taught him to think like a submariner. Active sonar, the ping and listen system every destroyer used, gave away your position the moment you transmitted. It worked for hunting U-boats because surface ships accepted that trade-off. They wanted submarines to know a destroyer was coming. But Hunt recognized active sonar's fatal flaw for the emerging Cold War reality. Soviet submarines could simply dive deep and wait silently, while American ships pinged uselessly into the void. The deep sound channel offered something revolutionary: one-way detection. A submarine running its diesel engines or electric motors created noise. Propeller cavitation, machinery vibration, hull resonance, every mechanical system aboard generated sound that radiated into the surrounding water. If that sound entered the channel at 3,000 feet, it would propagate horizontally for hundreds or thousands of miles. Hydrophones positioned in the channel could collect those sounds without transmitting anything, remaining completely invisible to the submarine. Hunt spent 1946 testing this theory from a research vessel off Massachusetts. His team lowered a hydrophone array to exactly 3,000 feet and waited. Within an hour, they detected a merchant ship passing 80 miles away. Its engine rhythm came through clearly enough to count propeller blade rate. Over 3 weeks, they cataloged fishing trawlers at 150 miles, a Navy cruiser at 240 miles, and on one remarkable afternoon, what Hunt believed was a submarine, American or foreign unknown, transiting at roughly 400 miles distance. The recordings convinced Hunt, but puzzled Navy acoustics experts. They understood the physics Hunt described, the temperature gradient bending sound waves back into the channel. What they questioned was practical application. Ocean noise, wave action, biological sounds, seismic rumbles, created constant background interference. How could operators distinguish a submarine from a whale or a distant storm? Hunt's answer was specificity. Submarines generated unique frequency signatures. A diesel engine turning at specific RPM, propeller blades chopping water at calculable intervals, reduction gears whining at characteristic pitches. These weren't random natural sounds. He demonstrated by playing back recordings with frequencies filtered. Strip away the biological noise below 20 Hz and the wave action above 200 Hz, and machinery sounds emerged distinctly. Hunt built a crude spectrum analyzer using war surplus electronics that displayed sound as visual patterns rather than audio. On the oscilloscope screen, a submarine appeared as a cluster of spikes at specific frequencies. A whale showed completely different patterns, broader, more organic, lacking the mechanical precision of rotating equipment. Through 1947 and into 1948, Hunt refined the detection methodology. He calculated that a standard diesel-electric submarine running submerged on batteries at 4 knots generated enough noise to be detected at 300 to 600 miles, depending on ocean conditions and the submarine's acoustic design. A submarine running surfaced or snorkeling with diesels engaged could be heard from 1,000 miles or more. Even a submarine attempting to run silent couldn't eliminate all sound. The crew moving, water pumps cycling, the simple act of a steel hull moving through water created detectable signatures. The Office of Naval Research funded a comprehensive study. Hunt's team deployed bottom-mounted hydrophones in the sound channel at 3 Atlantic locations, off Bermuda near the Bahamas and east of Cape Cod. Over 6 months, they tracked merchant traffic, naval exercises, and twice identified probable submarine contacts that Navy intelligence later confirmed as American boats on patrol. The system's effective range exceeded Hunt's conservative estimates. Under ideal conditions, they heard ships crossing the entire North Atlantic basin. By December 1948, Hunt had proven the concept worked. Now he needed to convince admirals that America should wire the ocean floor with thousands of hydrophones, creating a permanent surveillance network aimed at an enemy that didn't yet have a submarine fleet worth monitoring. That argument would prove harder than solving the physics. The Pentagon briefing room in March 1949 held 18 admirals, none of whom wanted to fund Hunt's proposal. Rear Admiral Ruthven Libby, head of submarine warfare, spelled out the problem bluntly. The Soviet Union had exactly 4 operational submarines capable of reaching American waters. Why spend millions installing permanent seabed hydrophone arrays to monitor a threat that barely existed? Hunt stood at the presentation board with Atlantic charts marked in red. He'd anticipated this objection for months. The Soviets had captured German U-boat manufacturing facilities intact at Danzig and Königsberg in 1945. They'd seized Type 20 Wing submarines, the most advanced boats Germany ever produced, and transported them to Leningrad shipyards. Soviet engineers were reverse engineering those designs right now. Intelligence estimates predicted the Red Fleet would launch 50 new submarines by 1952, possibly 100 by 1955. Hunt asked the admirals a simple question. Would they rather build the detection network now, while Soviet boats were few and loud, or wait until hundreds of quiet submarines already prowled the Atlantic undetected? The comparison Hunt drew was strategic. During World War II, Germany never had more than 40 U-boats operational simultaneously in the Atlantic, yet they nearly strangled Britain's supply lines. The Soviets would have triple that number within 5 years, operating from bases that offered direct access to NATO shipping lanes. Without a detection system, those submarines would be ghosts, invisible until they struck. Admiral Forrest Sherman, Chief of Naval Operations, asked about cost. Hunt had worked those numbers carefully with engineers from Bell Laboratories and Western Electric. Each listening station required 20 to 40 hydrophones suspended in the sound channel, connected by armored cables to shore-based processing facilities. The hydrophones themselves were relatively simple. Piezoelectric crystals that converted pressure waves into electrical signals. The expensive components were the cables, specially manufactured to survive years on the ocean floor under immense pressure, and the shore installations with their acres of recording equipment and analyst workstations. Hunt proposed starting with 4 stations positioned at strategic Atlantic choke points. Caesar 1 would sit off the Grand Banks near Newfoundland, monitoring the northern approach. Caesar 2 near Bermuda would cover the mid-Atlantic gap. Caesar 3 off the Bahamas would catch anything heading toward the Caribbean or Gulf of Mexico. Caesar 4 near the Azores would listen for submarines leaving European waters. Total cost, $42 million for installation, plus $3 million annually for operations and maintenance. Sherman noted the Navy was simultaneously funding nuclear submarine development, aircraft carrier construction, and jet fighter programs. $42 million represented serious money for a system that might detect submarines or might produce nothing but whale songs and ocean static. Hunt countered with detection ranges his tests had proven, 600 miles minimum, potentially double that under favorable conditions. No other technology offered that capability. Radar couldn't penetrate water. Aircraft could patrol limited areas for limited hours. Surface ships made noise that warned submarines to hide. Only passive sonar in the deep sound channel provided persistent, undetectable monitoring across entire ocean basins. The debate stretched across 3 meetings in March and April. Hunt found an unexpected ally in Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was pushing his own controversial program to develop nuclear-powered submarines. Rickover understood that if America built silent nuclear boats, the Soviets would eventually build them too. The nation that heard enemy submarines first would control underwater warfare for the next 50 years. On May 3, 1949, Sherman authorized Project Caesar, the sound surveillance system, which engineers would abbreviate as SOSUS. Hunt had 18 months to prove the concept worked before funding reviews could kill the program. He needed to find coastline with the right underwater topology, convince the Army Corps of Engineers to help with construction, and train a cadre of sonar operators who could distinguish submarine machinery from biological noise. The easy part was over. Construction of Caesar 1 began in April 1951 off Shelburne, Nova Scotia, and immediately encountered problems Hunt hadn't anticipated. Western Electric's engineers arrived with 96 hydrophones, each weighing 40 pounds, designed to hang from moorings anchored to the continental shelf at precisely 3,000 feet depth. The first mooring snapped during deployment when cables snagged on underwater rock formations. The second mooring deployed successfully but produced no signal. Salt water had penetrated a cable junction box during the 8-hour descent. Carl Kosuth, Western Electric's chief field engineer, spent 3 weeks redesigning the cable connections. He replaced every junction with double-sealed brass housings filled with dielectric gel. Even microscopic leaks at 3,000 feet depth would short the circuits within days. The pressure at that depth reached 1,300 pounds per square inch, enough to compress cable insulation and force water through gaps invisible to the naked eye. The hydrophone moorings themselves presented another challenge. They couldn't simply anchor cables to the seafloor because strong currents would create vibration noise that masked submarine sounds. SOSUS's team designed a system using concrete deadweight anchors weighing 2,000 pounds each, with the hydrophone array suspended above the bottom on syntactic foam floats that maintained neutral buoyancy. The array had to remain stable in currents, yet not drag across rocks during storms. Each mooring took 6 hours to deploy from the support vessel, and any mistake meant hauling everything back up, another 8 hours, to start over. By August 1951, Caesar 1 had operational arrays, but the shore station wasn't ready. The facility sat on a rocky hillside overlooking the harbor, requiring excavation of 40,000 cubic yards of granite to create a stable foundation. Inside, technicians were installing recording equipment that occupied an area the size of a basketball court. Rows of reel-to-reel tape machines captured every sound the hydrophones detected. Oscilloscope displays showed frequency patterns, and in the center, 12 operator stations where sailors would spend 8-hour shifts wearing headphones, listening to the Atlantic. Commander Robert Gautier, assigned to oversee Caesar 1 operations, faced a training problem nobody had solved. How do you teach someone to hear submarines? The Navy had sonar operators with years of experience, but they'd learned active sonar, listening for echoes of their own pings. This was different. Passive sonar operators needed to distinguish biological sounds, weather noise, merchant ships, fishing boats, naval vessels, and submarines, often hearing all of them simultaneously at varying distances. Hunt spent September through November at Shelburne developing a training program. He recorded everything: shrimp clicking, whale songs, ice calving from Arctic flows, propeller cavitation from different ship types. Operators learned that humpback whales produced sounds between 20 and 4,000 hertz. Snapping shrimp concentrated around 2,000 to 5,000 hertz. Distant storms created broadband rumbles below 100 hertz. But diesel engines running at 400 RPM generated a fundamental tone at approximately 6.7 hertz, with harmonics at predictable intervals. Electric motors produced higher frequency whines. Propeller blade rates created distinct tonals that operators could count. The first confirmed submarine detection came on December 12, 1951. Operator Second Class James Monroe heard machinery noise at bearing 087 degrees, range estimated at 340 miles based on signal strength. The contact maintained steady course and speed for 6 hours before fading beyond detection range. Gautier requested Navy intelligence confirm whether American submarines were operating in that sector. None were. The contact was either British, unlikely that far west, or Soviet. Caesar 2 off Bermuda went operational in March 1952. Caesar 3 in the Bahamas followed in August. By the time Caesar 4 activated near the Azores in January 1953, the system had logged 47 probable submarine contacts. Hunt's gamble was paying off, but the Navy wanted more coverage. The North Atlantic held gaps where submarines could slip through undetected. Filling those gaps would require tripling the number of arrays. The moment that justified 4 years of work and $50 million in expenditures arrived at 0340 hours on June 8, 1954, at Caesar 2's Operations Center in Bermuda. Petty Officer First Class Daniel Shaw detected a diesel engine signature at bearing 105 degrees, approximately 180 miles east. The frequency analysis showed machinery running at 420 RPM, slightly faster than American submarines typically operated. Shaw marked the contact and began tracking. Over the next hour, the signature strengthened as the submarine approached closer to the Bermuda arrays. Shaw counted 7 propeller blades based on cavitation harmonics. American fleet boats used 4-blade propellers. British submarines typically had 5 or 6 blades. 7 blades matched Soviet design specifications intelligence had warned about. The Whiskey-class submarines rolling out of Baltic shipyards. Lieutenant Commander Paul Hammond, the watch officer, called in additional operators to verify Shaw's analysis. By 0600 hours, 3 separate operators confirmed the contact. The submarine was traveling northwest at approximately 8 knots, running surfaced or snorkeling with diesels engaged. Hammond contacted Caesar 1 in Nova Scotia. Their arrays picked up the same contact at bearing 201 degrees. Triangulation placed the submarine 240 miles southeast of Bermuda, heading toward the East Coast shipping lanes. This was exactly the scenario Hunt had described to skeptical admirals 5 years earlier. A Soviet submarine crossing the Atlantic, detectable at vast ranges through the Deep Sound Channel. Hammond notified Atlantic Fleet headquarters. Navy patrol aircraft launched from bases in Bermuda and North Carolina, but Hammond told them to maintain surveillance only, no aggressive intercepts. The intelligence value of tracking this submarine undetected exceeded the tactical value of forcing it to surface. For the next 60 hours, SOSUS operators watched the contact crawl across their displays. The submarine maintained course toward Cape Hatteras, unaware that hydrophones were recording every machinery vibration from hundreds of miles away. Operators rotated shifts, but never lost the signal. They documented how the submarine's acoustic signature changed when it dove to periscope depth. Engine noise faded, replaced by quieter electric motor sounds. They logged when it surfaced to charge batteries, diesel noise strengthening dramatically. On June 11th, approximately 200 miles east of Virginia, the submarine turned northeast and began a long arc back toward the Atlantic. SOSUS arrays tracked it for another 1,800 miles as it crossed north of the Azores. Caesar 4 picked up the contact on June 16th, confirming the submarine was heading home. Total tracking distance exceeded 3,000 miles. Total tracking time was 134 hours. The submarine's crew never knew they'd been heard across an entire ocean. Hunt received a classified briefing packet in Cambridge a week later. Navy intelligence confirmed the contact was indeed a Soviet Whiskey-class submarine on what appeared to be a proving cruise, testing how far it could range into Western waters. The boat probably surfaced occasionally to gather radio intelligence or conduct periscope observations of shipping traffic. Standard Cold War reconnaissance. But the critical revelation was that Soviet submarine commanders operated under the assumption they were invisible once submerged beyond a few dozen miles from shore. The Bermuda tracking event changed Navy strategic planning immediately. If SOSUS could monitor a single submarine crossing the Atlantic for 3 days straight, it could monitor dozens simultaneously. Admiral Gerald Wright, commander of Atlantic Fleet, authorized expansion of the array network. Instead of 4 listening stations covering major approaches, he wanted comprehensive coverage from Greenland to the Caribbean, from the East Coast to the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Hunt's vindication came in the form of a question from Wright's staff. How many arrays would it take to ensure no Soviet submarine entered the Atlantic undetected? Hunt calculated that 22 installations positioned along the continental shelf and strategic underwater ridges would create an overlapping detection grid with no gaps larger than 200 miles. The Admiral approved the expansion plan within a month. Hunt's physics experiment had become the foundation of America's undersea surveillance strategy. The expansion program that began in 1955 represented the most ambitious underwater construction project attempted to that point. Navy engineers identified locations based on 3 criteria: proximity to Soviet submarine routes, favorable underwater topology for hydrophone placement, and availability of coastline where shore stations could operate discreetly. The array positions formed a fence across every major choke point between the Soviet Union and the Atlantic shipping lanes America needed to protect. Installation crews worked northward from the existing Caesar stations. Arrays went in off Argentia, Newfoundland, covering the strait between Greenland and Canada, where Soviet submarines from Murmansk had to pass. Another station at Keflavik, Iceland, monitored the Denmark Strait. A third at Brodie, Wales, listened to submarines exiting the Norwegian Sea into the North Atlantic. Each installation required negotiating agreements with host nations, the United States convinced allies that SOSUS protected their interests too. But diplomatic tensions surfaced when local populations noticed the construction activity and asked questions. The technical challenges multiplied with northern locations. Arrays off Greenland had to survive iceberg collisions. Engineers designed protective cages around hydrophones and positioned arrays deeper than the 3,000-foot sweet spot to avoid ice keels that extended hundreds of feet below the surface. The acoustic performance degraded slightly at 3,500 feet, but survival trumped optimal sensitivity. Western Electric manufactured hydrophones at a facility in New Jersey that operated 24 hours daily to meet installation schedules. Each hydrophone started as a cylinder of lead zirconate titanate ceramic, a piezoelectric material that generated voltage when compressed by sound pressure waves. Engineers potted the ceramic elements in rubber compound, encased them in corrosion-resistant titanium housings, then tested each unit in pressure chambers simulating 4,000 feet of seawater. Failure rate ran about 8%, and every failed unit meant delays while replacements were manufactured and shipped to installation sites. The cable systems presented the most persistent problems. Armored cables connecting hydrophone arrays to shore stations stretched up to 40 miles across the continental shelf, lying exposed on the seafloor in some areas, buried in others where fishing trawlers might snag them. AT&T's submarine cable division designed a triple-layer construction: copper conductors for signal transmission, steel armor wire for strength, and an outer jacket of tarred jute impregnated with asphalt for protection against marine borers. Each mile of cable weighed 6 tons. Laying it required specialized vessels that maintained precise tension while spooling cable onto the ocean floor at exactly the right depth contour. By 1958, the network included 18 operational stations. Arrays at Nantucket and Cape May covered approaches to New York and Philadelphia. Stations at Mayport, Florida, and Freeport, Bahamas, monitored the Straits of Florida. A critical installation at Barbados sat astride the Deepwater Passage Soviet submarines used to reach Cuban waters after Castro's revolution aligned with Moscow. The geometry worked perfectly. Barbados arrays detected submarines 400 miles to the east and west, creating an acoustic barrier across the entire Caribbean approach. The Atlantic segment reached 22 arrays by 1961, but the Navy was already planning Pacific installations. Soviet submarine bases at Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk required different choke point coverage. Arrays went in at Adak, Alaska, monitoring the Bering Sea passages. Another network stretched from Washington State to California to Hawaii, creating detection barriers across approaches to San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Pearl Harbor. The shore facilities evolved into small cities dedicated to listening. Trained operators numbered over 400 by 1960, working in pairs during 8-hour watches. Each pair monitored 40 to 60 hydrophone channels simultaneously, watching oscilloscope displays for the characteristic frequency spikes that indicated machinery. When operators detected something, they initiated detailed tracking procedures, measuring bearing, estimating range from signal strength, calculating course and speed from bearing rate changes. Paper plots grew into tracking boards showing every contact's movement across hundreds of miles of ocean. Hunt visited installations periodically during the expansion, but increasingly stepped back from daily operations. The system had grown beyond one physicist's oversight into an institutional capability, managed by hundreds of personnel across 2 oceans. Inside the windowless facility at Naval Facility Barbados, Petty Officer Second Class Thomas Hendricks sat at Station 4 wearing headphones connected to hydrophone array Charlie 7, positioned 280 miles northeast in 3,200 feet of water. The sound reaching his ears had traveled through the deep channel for 6 hours before the hydrophones converted pressure waves into electrical signals, which traveled up 40 miles of cable through amplification circuits and into his headset. What Hendricks heard was a Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine running submerged on electric motors somewhere between Barbados and the Azores, heading west toward Cuban waters. He'd been tracking this particular contact for 3 days, not this specific submarine. Hendricks had never seen it, would never see it, but rather the acoustic signature it produced. He knew it as Contact 471, but in his mind he called it squeaky because one of its reduction gears produced a distinctive high-frequency whine at 847 Hz that none of the other foxtrots exhibited. Hendricks had tracked maybe 60 Soviet submarines over 18 months at Barbados, and he could identify 12 of them individually now by their unique machinery sounds. The skill development process had taken months of concentrated listening. Lieutenant Howard Chen, the facilities training officer, explained it as learning a new language. The first month, operators heard only chaos, overlapping sounds from biological sources, distant storms, surface ships, everything mixed together in incomprehensible noise. But the human auditory system was remarkably good at pattern recognition when trained. Chen had operators listen to recorded submarine signatures for 4 hours daily, learning to pick out the specific tones that indicated machinery. Diesel engine fundamental frequency, motor whine, propeller blade rate, reduction gear harmonics. After 3 months, operators like Hendricks began hearing structure in the chaos. The biological sounds became background. His brain learned to filter out whale songs and snapping shrimp automatically. The mechanical sounds came forward. A merchant ship 200 miles away sounded different from a submarine 400 miles away, not just in volume, but in frequency content. Merchant ships had single large propellers turning slowly. Submarines had twin screws turning faster, creating different cavitation patterns. The individual submarine signatures emerged after 6 months of listening. Each boat had unique characteristics based on minor manufacturing variations and machinery wear patterns. Squeaky had that reduction gear whine. Another Foxtrot Hendricks tracked regularly produced a 60 Hz tonal that suggested generator imbalance. A Zulu-class submarine had asymmetric propellers. The port screw was slightly noisier than starboard, creating a distinctive beat pattern. Operators maintained logs that read like detective novels. Contact 471 departed Murmansk region approximately October 12th. Based on detection time at Iceland arrays, traveled south at 8 knots for 6 days, stopped for 4 hours on October 18th, possibly conducting repairs or training exercises. Resumed course toward Caribbean, detected off Bermuda. October 21st, currently tracking at bearing 247 degrees, range estimated 340 miles. Destination probably Cuban waters for patrol or resupply operations. The Navy compiled all this tracking data into individual submarine histories. Intelligence analysts cross-referenced SOSUS detections with other sources, radio intercepts, satellite photography of Soviet ports, human intelligence from dock workers. They built profiles of each submarine, when it went to sea, how long patrols lasted, which routes it preferred, what operating patterns it followed. Some Soviet submarines operated aggressively, running fast and noisy, as if daring American forces to respond. Others moved cautiously, staying deep and slow, trying to remain undetected. Hendricks marked his log at 1830 hours. Contact 471, bearing now 245 degrees. Bearing rate indicates course change to south-southwest. Speed unchanged at estimated 6 knots. He tracked Squeaky for another 12 hours before his shift ended and the next operator pair took over. Somewhere in that vast darkness between Barbados and Africa, a Soviet crew worked their boat toward Cuba, completely unaware that a petty officer in Barbados had been listening to their reduction gear whine for 72 hours straight, plotting every turn, every speed change, every mile they traveled across an ocean they believed protected their movements with silence. By 1968, Soviet submarine designers understood they had a problem. American forces were tracking their boats with improbable accuracy. Destroyers appeared exactly where submarines transited. Patrol aircraft dropped sonobuoys along routes submarines had taken hours earlier. The pattern suggested American detection capabilities far exceeded what Soviet naval intelligence had estimated. Engineers at the Rubin Design Bureau in Leningrad received orders to make submarines quieter. The challenge was fundamental physics. A submarine moving through water displaced fluid, creating turbulence. Propellers churned water, creating cavitation bubbles that collapsed with audible pops. Diesel engines vibrated, transmitting sound through the hull into surrounding water. Electric motors produced electromagnetic noise that could be converted to acoustic signatures. Pumps, generators, ventilation fans, even crew members walking on steel decks generated sounds that radiated outward. Soviet engineers attacked each noise source methodically. They redesigned propellers with 7 blades instead of 4, distributing cavitation energy across more surface area. They wrapped machinery in rubber mounts that absorbed vibration before it reached the hull. They installed anechoic tiles on hull exteriors, rubberized coatings with tiny air pockets that absorbed sound waves rather than reflecting them. The tiles made submarines look like they wore thick black wetsuits, adding weight and reducing speed slightly, but the acoustic benefit was measurable. The first notably quiet Soviet submarine detected by SOSUS was a Victor-class nuclear boat in 1972. Operators at Naval Facility Keflavik noticed immediately that something was different. The Victor produced detection ranges of 200 to 300 miles instead of the 400 to 600 miles they'd grown accustomed to with older Soviet designs. The submarine was still audible, nuclear reactors couldn't be silenced completely, and the Victor's steam turbines generated characteristic tonals, but the overall sound level had dropped significantly. Hunt, now semi-retired but consulting regularly with Navy acoustics programs, recognized the challenge this presented. SOSUS had been designed assuming Soviet submarines would remain as noisy as the Whiskey and Foxtrot classes. If Soviet engineers successfully reduced acoustic signatures by another 10 decibels, detection ranges would shrink to 100 miles or less. The Atlantic surveillance network would develop gaps where submarines could slip through unheard. The Navy's response came in 2 forms. First, upgrade the existing hydrophones with more sensitive piezoelectric elements and lower noise amplification circuits. Western electric engineers developed new hydrophone designs that detected sounds at half the previous intensity threshold. Second, deploy additional arrays to fill coverage gaps. Between 1970 and 1978, the Navy installed 14 new SOSUS stations, concentrating on areas where quiet submarines might exploit weak detection zones. The technical arms race accelerated through the 1970s. Soviet designers built the Akula-class submarines with rafted machinery, entire engine rooms mounted on springs that isolated vibration from the hull. They perfected propeller designs that delayed cavitation to higher speeds. By 1985, an Akula running slowly on batteries could pass within 50 miles of a SOSUS array undetected if ocean conditions were unfavorable. But SOSUS operators adapted too. They learned that quiet submarines still made noise, just different noise. Hull flow sounds as water moved past. The submarine became detectable when machinery noise dropped. Transient sounds from hatches closing, torpedo tube doors opening, or ballast systems cycling gave away positions even when propulsion remained silent. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell at Naval Facility Centerville Beach in California pioneered tracking techniques that focused on transients rather than continuous tonals, successfully tracking Soviet submarines that older methods missed. The cat-and-mouse game reached philosophical territory by the mid-1980s. Each side knew the other's capabilities generally, but not specifically. Soviet submarine commanders knew Americans could detect them somehow, but not the precise ranges or methods. SOSUS operators could hear Soviet boats, but couldn't always classify them quickly enough to vector attack submarines into intercept positions. The technological competition had created a stalemate where detection was possible, but not guaranteed, and silence was achievable, but not complete. Frederick Hunt died in 1985 at age 78, never having seen most of the SOSUS installations his discovery enabled. The system remained classified until partial declassification in 1991 after the Soviet Union collapsed. By then, the network included over 30 arrays monitoring both Atlantic and Pacific approaches to North America, with additional installations in the Mediterranean and Norwegian seas. The deep sound channel he'd discovered in 1944 had become the foundation for 40 years of undersea surveillance that fundamentally shaped Cold War naval strategy. The military legacy was clear. SOSUS tracked thousands of Soviet submarine transits, providing intelligence that allowed American attack submarines and surface forces to maintain tactical advantage throughout the Cold War. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, SOSUS detected every Soviet submarine attempting to reach Cuban waters, enabling the Navy to enforce the quarantine with precision. Soviet submarines never achieved the strategic surprise their designers intended because Hunt's hydrophones heard them coming from hundreds of miles away. But the deep sound channel's impact extended far beyond military applications. In 1991, oceanographers at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration gained access to declassified SOSUS data and discovered something remarkable. They could track whales across entire ocean basins. Blue whales, fin whales, and humpback whales all produced low-frequency calls that propagated through the sound channel exactly as submarine machinery sounds did. Researchers identified individual whales by their unique vocalizations and documented migration patterns across thousands of miles. Christopher Clark at Cornell University used SOSUS recordings to map whale populations in the Atlantic and Pacific. The data revealed that whale populations communicated across far greater distances than anyone had suspected. A blue whale off California could potentially hear another blue whale near Hawaii, 2,500 miles away. The ocean wasn't a barrier to communication. It was a highway for sound that connected marine mammals across hemispheres. The geological community found unexpected uses too. SOSUS arrays detected underwater volcanic eruptions, submarine earthquakes, and iceberg calving events in real time. In June 1993, hydrophones recorded a massive underwater volcanic eruption near the Juan de Fuca Ridge off Oregon, a discovery that led to the first direct observation of an active submarine volcanic event. Seismologists now routinely use data from repurposed SOSUS arrays to study earthquake activity in oceanic regions where land-based seismometers can't reach. The Navy maintained portions of the SOSUS network through the 1990s and into the 2000s. But the system's strategic importance declined as satellite surveillance and unmanned underwater vehicles offered alternative detection methods. Many arrays were deactivated, their hydrophones left on the seafloor to corrode slowly in the cold darkness they'd monitored for decades. Some installations transitioned to scientific research, rebranded as the Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, continuing to listen, but now for scientific rather than military purposes. Hunt's fundamental discovery, that temperature gradients create an acoustic waveguide in the ocean, remains valid physics today. Modern submarine designers still wrestle with the sound channel's existence. No amount of quieting technology can eliminate the fact that sound travels farther underwater than designers wish it would. Every submarine, no matter how quiet, leaves acoustic traces that propagate through the channel Hunt mapped 80 years ago. The Naval Facility Barbados closed in 1979. The building sat empty for years before the Barbados government demolished it in 1992. The hydrophone arrays remain on the seafloor 3 miles down, their cables cut, their electronics dark, but the sound channel continues transmitting whispers across the Atlantic, whale songs, distant storms, the occasional submarine, all traveling through that cold layer at 3,000 feet, where Frederick Hunt discovered that the ocean keeps no secrets from those who know how to listen.